We're going to be looking in 1 Samuel, if you'll open up to that book. We're going to be looking mostly in chapter 16, but we're actually going to start in chapter 8. 1 Samuel 16, but also starting chapter 8. It's not been often that I've had occasion to buy a vehicle or even go to a car lot, but recently I was at one, and I've been to kind of both kinds of car lots. And the more recent one was a well-known, if I said the name, you would know it, car lot that you hear advertised, and it's pretty big. And so I was there, but in the past, or in the recent past, I'd been to a car lot that was the other kind of car lot, where it's a buy here, pay here, and it's smaller, and the cars are older. And what I realized, though, being at both of those places, and being at this larger car lot, I realized they're kind of all the same. And this one's bigger, and the cars are newer, and they're nicer, and the people say maybe more of the right thing than they would at the other place, but they're really the same. It's just a difference in how polished it is. But the same kind of people work there. I'm not trying to disparage those people that work at car lots at all. I'm just saying it's the same. It just happens to look a little nicer on the outside. And when we see things like this in anywhere in life, it works as an illustration for what we're going to see in this lesson. And this is a story that you're familiar with, and we're going to try to not spend too much time on the story as a result of that. But in 1 Samuel chapter 16, David is anointed as king. And I promise that there are things that we can learn even if we do know the story. But of course, one of the major points of the story is to say that God doesn't judge the way that we do, and he doesn't look at the outward appearance as we do, but instead looks at the heart. And so we're going to take a look at this. And I will say this is part of something we're going to be doing throughout this year, is looking at the life of David and seeing what we can learn from it. And God said of David that he's a man after his own heart. And so what can we learn from David? Well, hopefully we can learn how to do that, how to be someone after God's own heart. So back in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So if we start in 1 Samuel 8, then we're going to see the demand of Israel for a king. Chapter 8, starting in verse 5. So again, 1 Samuel 8, verse 5. And they said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king, and to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." So we probably know that passage pretty well too, but Israel says, yeah, we know how God set it up for us, but we don't really like it. And instead, we kind of want to be like everybody around us. So they give into a sort of national level of peer pressure. And they ask for a king. And Samuel's kind of upset about this. I think it's twofold. One, he understands God's rejection, that the people are rejecting him. But also, I think maybe on kind of a personal level, Samuel says, well, my family was supposed to be the ones that were going to help Israel or lead Israel, and that's not going to be the case now. But regardless of Samuel's motivation, he's not pleased by it, but God also doesn't appear to be pleased by it. But this is what they want. And so God will give them a king. And of course, we know the first king of Israel is going to be Saul. And Saul is, in a way, he is chosen not because of who he is, because we know he's from a small tribe, a small family, not all that important overall. But on the other hand, Saul is impressive looking. It said that he stood head and shoulders above anyone else. And so people would look at him and think, well, yeah, okay, he deserves to be king. And that's the first king that we're introduced to. But the problem is Saul does what most people in authority end up doing at some point, which is overstepping their power, their authority. And certainly Saul does that. We see him in 1 Samuel 13. If you look in verses 12 and following, well, actually the whole chapter is the story. But in 1 Samuel chapter 12, Saul does his first wrong as king, or first major thing that he does wrong, where he tries to sacrifice an offering to God instead of letting the priest do so. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, he's not authorized to do that, but he thought that he had the authorization just because he's king. He starts to think, in a sense, that maybe he is the King of Kings rather than God being a king over him and him just being a king, which is really all that he is. But in verse 12 of chapter 13, he says, I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. Now, there's a separate lesson in that sometimes when you feel compelled to do something, that doesn't make it right. And it didn't make it right for Saul. In fact, Samuel says in the next verse, you have done foolishly. Why? Because you went with what you thought. And what you thought was not correct. And we see this from Saul initially, but we also see in chapter 15, if you look in verse 23, after Saul has spared Agag, which is a king of a foreign army, it is told to him by Samuel, again 15:23, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry, because you have rejected the word of the Lord. He also has rejected you from being king. So twice now Saul has been told, you are not going to continue reigning as king because of the things that you've done wrong. And so that sets us up for King David needing to be anointed. Why? Because Saul, in spite of what he looked like, spiritually was insufficient to be king. Because he made mistake after mistake, at least these two. And God said, that's it. You cannot continue to reign as king if this is the pattern that you're going to follow. So then we go to chapter 16. In chapter 16, verse 1, we'll go ahead and read that. It says, now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons. So let's start with Jesse here. Jesse is going to be the father of David, of course. That's who we're being introduced to here. But Jesse, in one sense, is kind of a nobody, but in another sense, he's important. Jesse is a nobody in the sense that he's not of a royal lineage. He's not related to Saul in any way. He's not one of the judges. He's not particularly important by himself. On the other hand, he does have a kind of impressive lineage. So Jesse is the grandson of Ruth and Boaz, which means his dad is Obed, which is the child of Ruth and Boaz. So he's very closely connected to that story. Of course, that also means that his grandmother or great-grandmother on one side would be Naomi, the mother of Ruth, but on the other side, if you trace Jesus' genealogy all the way back through Boaz, his mother is Rahab. Yes, that Rahab. So he's tied into a couple of major Bible stories that we already know about, and that means that David is going to be tied to those stories as well. So Jesse is from Bethlehem, and of course that's important because Ruth, Boaz specifically, is from Bethlehem. It's also important later on because that means Joseph will have to go back to Bethlehem, where his family is from, whenever the census is taken. That's why Jesus ends up in Bethlehem. But anyway, that's Jesse. But from Jesse's children, God says, I have provided myself a king among his sons. I've provided myself a king. Let me make one point first here. At this time, it's hard to be precise, but David is probably about 15 years old. Okay? Well, that means that God provided himself a king when? Well, not the same day that he needed him. But instead, God has been working on a king for 15 years now, and actually it's going to take even longer before David becomes king. So God's plans have plans that we don't even know about, but God always has preparations in place, and in this case, he has a king, someone that's a viable option for king already there in the person of David. So that's the first part of this. Now, in the next few verses, 2 through about 5, there is sort of a plan that's laid out to avoid the wrath of Saul. So Saul, as we know, is kind of hot-tempered, and he's probably going to kill Samuel if he finds him anointing another person as king. And so they're going to try to avoid that. Now, it might seem questionable ethics-wise. So we're not going to get into that right now. We'll have another lesson sometime soon on white lies and situational ethics, but that's not this lesson. But we might bring that up at that time. But all we need to know is that they're going up to Bethlehem for the purpose of an offering, a sacrifice. And in addition to that, we know that Samuel's going so that he can anoint a new king. So he knows it's one of the sons of Jesse. He doesn't know which one. And so we get to the well-known part of the story, get down to verse 6. So it was, when they came, that he looked at Eliab, which would be the oldest of Jesse's sons, and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. So he sees this first son, he says, yep, that's him. That's got to be him right there. Now, why did he think that? Well, we don't know. We're not told exactly, but based on God's response in the next verse, Eliab was impressive in some way. Something about him said, yeah, he looks like a king. Obviously, this is going to be God's choice. Let's go ahead and anoint him right now. And then God says, not quite. So God, in the next verse, again, very well-known verse, he says, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. Well, it doesn't matter what he looks like if God has rejected him as a king. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Now, in one way, that's kind of a nice figurative way of speaking, that we see things physically and God sees things more spiritually or on the level of the soul. But it's also true. What one of us can look into the heart of someone else? It can't happen. Can we see into the soul of someone else? It can't happen. You might be able to get to know some of the aspects of that person's soul or their heart, but we can't do that. And that's exactly how God looks at everybody and everything. So God looks at not the physical appearance, but instead he looks at the heart. Now, here's a question that I think is worth asking. Was Eliab, this first brother, was he a bad person? Was he wicked and terrible? Probably not. Was he unfit to be king in every way? Probably not. He was probably pretty average. In fact, I imagine he was a great warrior, given how David's brothers go and fight Goliath after this, or pretend to fight Goliath. But he would have been a warrior, just like David was. He would have grown up raising sheep. They would have been about as similar as any two people could be. And yet God says, not him, but him. So there is a difference. But it's not necessarily because he's a bad person. It's just that God did not choose him. And, of course, God knows that maybe later on, Eliab, if he had become king, couldn't have handled the pressure or couldn't have handled having that much power and would have become a bad king. We see that over and over in the history of the Jewish kings, that they, once they get into power especially, start to do things against God's will. But after this, of course, we also know that all of the other brothers pass in front of Samuel, and one by one God says, no, it's not him either. Okay, is there anyone else left? And so we get down to the text that was read for us. And verse 11, there remains yet the youngest. Okay, so there is one more, and he's keeping the sheep. That's how unimportant David is at this point. But it is this one that's going to be chosen. So he is the last and least in this situation. The last one to be presented and the least of them. He's the youngest of them. Now, much more so than today, Jewish culture emphasized the older sibling, especially the older brother, because they would have been the one to inherit the major share of their parents' estate. So today it doesn't quite work like that, but at this time, it was pretty important to be the oldest. And yet, what does God do over and over again? Every time that God has the choice between brothers, who does he choose? Seemingly. You go through the Old Testament and you say, okay, let's start at the beginning. Who's the first brother that God chooses? It's Abel. Well, Abel's the older brother, and yet he rejects Cain. And then you go to Isaac, and you go to Moses, and Jacob, and Joseph, and then Ephraim after that, and then Gideon, and David, and Solomon. God chooses the younger. Why? Because he doesn't see as man sees. He looks at the heart. And there's either something about the heart of these individuals, or it's just that same principle that Jesus teaches, that the first will be last. But God chooses not based on the way that we would choose. And certainly he does that in the case of David here. Now David, though, to his credit, verse 12 says that he's not bad, or not bad looking even. It says that he was ruddy, which means to be red-faced. It's the same word that's used of Esau. It means red in a good way, a healthy looking way is kind of the idea. With bright eyes, or as Gary's translation accurately translates it, with beautiful eyes is what it means, and good looking. So again, there's nothing wrong with him. He's certainly not bad. He's just not as impressive as the first brothers to come past Samuel. So the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." Out of all of these brothers and out of everyone possible in Israel, this is who I choose. So not based on how Samuel would do it, but that's what we see. Beyond this description of David, we get another description pretty shortly after this in verse 18. So kind of after our story's done, but in verse 18 it says, "Then one of the servants answered and said, Look, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him." So yet again, it is not based on his appearance, but there are a lot of good qualities about David, even as a 15-year-old. But this is who God chooses. Once he's anointed, it says that the Spirit comes on him, and that from that day forward, he seemed to be blessed of the Lord. And that makes sense because he's going to be king. And that's kind of funny because the next 15 years are going to be pretty awful for David. There's going to be a lot of difficulty that takes place. And yet, it says the Spirit of the Lord is with him. But what can we take from this text, from this passage, and what can we learn for ourselves? This takes place some 3,000 years ago. So how is it applicable to us today? Well, let's start with this. And this is kind of the point of this whole passage, but be careful how you judge. And I know that that's the application anyone would make when telling this story, and that's fine because it needs to be made. But let's go a step farther than that. Let's not just say, be careful how you judge, but instead, how do we judge like God judges? If we want to have a heart like God's, be someone after God's own heart, how do we do that? How do we judge as he would judge? Well, a couple things. Number one, be slow to judge. Don't just go on the first impression. If you do that, you'll end up kind of like Samuel. And second part of that is listen before you talk. Because God could have said verse 7 before verse 6 happened, if Samuel had let him. But instead Samuel says, "Oh, surely it's this guy." And God says, no, calm down. Be a little bit more patient than that. And sometimes that's all it takes for us to change our first impression to the right impression. To say, okay, well, that's not actually who that person is. I just didn't see them for who they were. So be slow to judge. And then, of course, the third thing is to be more spiritually minded than physically minded. So Samuel's judgment was based on the physical, but God's judgment is based on the spiritual. Second principle here that we can learn is that the least will be greatest. Now that's true from Luke chapter 9, verse 48 in the New Testament. That's how Jesus phrases it. The person who thinks that they're the best usually ends up in last place, and the person that thinks that they're of least importance will end up being the greatest. And that's true for David here. That can be true for us, or should be. A third principle is that we can, and we often do, misjudge things. So let's spend a second addressing that, thinking about what we misjudge. One example that I thought of is that we can misjudge entire churches. My dad, it's not this congregation that he's going to this morning, but a different congregation out of state. He went to it, and he said that they were a smaller congregation than here, significantly smaller than here, and that you wouldn't have thought much of it, and yet they, on a monthly basis, support him more than any other church. Well, what if he went in as a missionary and said, "Oh, well, looks like slim pickings here. Maybe I should just go on to the church down the street, and maybe I'll have better luck there." Well, that would be misjudging what that church was able and willing to do for the mission work that he's doing. We can also, of course, misjudge people. Let's go back to our initial illustration of car buying. To me, kind of disturbing statistic is that if you pull up to a stoplight and there are 4 cars, then 3 out of 4 of those cars are not going to be owned by the individual that's driving it. What does that mean? It means that 75% of the cars on the road are either financed or leased. And in both cases, you do not own the vehicle. And you might make a case that leasing is somehow better. We're not going to get into that. But the point is, they don't own them. Well, what does that mean about how you can view somebody's car and what you can know about them? Nothing. It doesn't matter how much money they make, really, or how it doesn't affect their net worth based on what they drive, because most people that are driving that vehicle can't afford to be in that vehicle anyway. So physical appearance is not the same thing as what's underneath. And that's still just a physical analogy, but it's even more true when we get into the spiritual. That when we judge things on a physical level, that will not reflect what is true on a spiritual level. With that, imagine if God chose kings just based on physical appearance. You might say, well, I guess David's oldest brother would have been king, right? No, if it's just based on physical appearance, Saul would have still been king. But that's not how it works, because the spiritual is more important. So even though Saul may have been the most impressive specimen of a king that you could find, it doesn't matter, because spiritually he was unfit to be king. And God looks at the heart, not at the person. Another thing we can say with this is not to underestimate people. Specifically, of course, David in this example. We looked at verse 18, but let's look at it again. Verse 18, it says, "Look, I've seen the sons of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. He is a skillful player of the lyre or harp. He's a mighty man of valor. He is a man of war. He is prudent in speech. He's a handsome person, and the Lord is with him." So out of those 6 descriptions, how many can you tell by looking at him? Can you tell how good he is at playing a harp by looking at him? Can you tell if the Lord is with him by looking at him? Can you tell that he's a mighty man of valor by looking at him? No. But God can tell, and God knows all of those things. But if we take our first impression, then we won't learn any of that. So we judge, or we try to judge, as God judges. But the other side of this, like we said, David's 15 years old now, and God anoints him as king because he can see these things in him, these good characteristics. And yet, God still waits 15 more years before making him the king of all of Israel. So just because David had some good qualities here, that doesn't mean that he was ready. And sometimes that's going to be the case for us as well. Just because we have some good things going for us, that doesn't mean that God's plan is going to work on our timing. But instead, he would finish getting him ready during that kind of rough 15 years after he's anointed. Last thing we'll say is this. It's more of a question, but what can we do based on our, not physical appearance, but based on our spiritual appearance before God? What can we do for him? So David is 15 years old, and you would think maybe he can't do much for God. Well, he will. He will later as king, but even pretty soon after this, he's going to defeat a giant who is an enemy of Israel. That's kind of impressive. So what could he do for God? Well, again, initially he could still do some, but later on he's going to be able to do even more. We tend to base our expectations on what we can see physically. And that's true throughout Scripture, and that's true in our lives. But when we do that for ourselves and we say, well, okay, looking at my physical situation, looking at how much money's in my bank account, looking at my career trajectory, and whatever you want to say, you might say, well, I can't really do much. But then you look at it spiritually and say, well, if I expect more of myself spiritually, what could I do? If I expect to be just a Christian that comes to church, guess what I'm going to be? I'm going to be just a Christian that comes to church. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good starting point. But what if I expect instead that I'm going to be as useful as possible to God? then what can God do with me? Well, he can make me a lot more useful than I am right now. What if I say, instead of being just someone who comes and sits in a pew, I say, well, I want to be someone that converts other people to Christ, like we talked about in class this morning. I want to be someone that convicts people, that goes out and reaches out and says, you know what, this is what you need to know in order to be saved. If I say, well, I want to convert 10 people this year, I don't know if it'll happen, but I'll get a lot closer than if I don't have that as an expectation for myself. So when we look at David, we look at his example and we say, well, physically, was he the most impressive? I guess not, compared to his brothers, although he seems impressive enough, so they must have been something. But we look at David and say, it's not based on the physical. It's based on the heart. And God knows the heart better than we even do. So we look at the physical and we say, well, I don't know what I can do, but spiritually speaking, if my heart is transformed to look more like God's, then what can I not do? This morning, if you want to be more like God, follow the example of David, and we'll follow his example throughout this year. But this morning, of course, getting closer to God starts with being converted to God. And you have an opportunity to do that this morning. We talked about it in class, but you hear that word being preached or being taught to you individually, and you believe that word to be true. You repent of the sin in your life. You make a change in your life. You confess that Jesus is the Son of God, and that you believe that. And after that, you're baptized into Christ. And from that point forward, you try to live like Christ rather than like what the physical appearance would have us to think that we are. We become more like God. This morning, if you're ready to do that, or this morning, if you need assistance from the church in some other way, in any other way, this is your opportunity. This is your time. If you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.